All right. It is beginning of May. I've just taken my last final. When is my last final for all of college? Um, I'm packing for school, or not school, I'm packing for camp. And I've just finished reading Through the Looking Glass by Carroll. This is the shorter of these two books that are in this little collection. Through the Looking Glass is interesting because, firstly, a lot of these Alice books are created for Alice Liddell, who was the daughter of a friend of Lewis Carroll's. And so like there's this kind of feeling about these Alice books, which is very kind of bedtime story type. This one, Through the Looking Glass, feels much more so than the Alice in Wonderland. It feels very much more like kind of a episodical bedtime story type deal. And the reason I'm saying that is because before there was this, I should say before, in Alice in Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland, as I had mentioned, there's this kind of weird kind of point to point to point in every chapter, but it still kind of flows through. Through the Looking Glass, it feels very much more like 10 little snippets of things that are just going next to next to next to next that don't feel very connected other than having the same characters in them. So yeah, right. Through the Looking Glass is also interesting because it is basically it is set up as the imagination of Alice being stuck or being grounded or something, and basically imagining what life is like in the opposite world, or in the mirror world, right? Because to our brain, and the way that our brain interprets things, it looks like mirrors are the opposite of us, right? But so, right, that's kind of this outline of what's happening. What also makes it really interesting is that the book is basically set up in a style in which your chapters of things actually happening, which are chapters 2 through 10, I think, maybe, are set in the style of a pawn going across a chessboard to become a queen, right? And it's this fun little thing of kind of trials and tribulations, but then also the fun experiences of traveling and whatnot. But then also because of that, right, then once again we get back to this idea of this kind of episodical bedtime story type thing, in which, right, if you were gonna, like, you could read this to a kid, you would just read a chapter a night, and that would be great because there's each one's its own little story. Yeah. Other fun things to mention about this book. Let's see, anything else that really goes to the top of my head. Oh, right. It's also a weird thing about this book is Lewis Carroll. I don't remember what Lewis Carroll's real name is. But he's like at his core like a mathematician, kind of logic type person. And so a lot of these things that are happening in the stories are based in logic. They're based in kind of, if X equals Y, then Z, right? And we just get that kind of constantly throughout. of these riddles and wordplays and logic needed for things. But then also we get this kind of weird juxtaposition in which Alice is somehow the most logical one, because Alice has the ability to take things with their context, right? Versus all of our other characters, in which you'll say something and then they will go off based on a homonym to something that you said, right? The one that immediately comes to mind is the Queens ask, "How do you bake bread?" And then Alice says, "Oh, well, you need flour." And then as in FLOUR, right? But then the Queens immediately ask, instead of giving time for like explanation or, making sure that we get, context for everything, immediately go to flour as in FLOWER, right? And then we get to then the Queens ask about ground, how much ground is needed, or how do you grow it, or how do you pick it? And then Alice starts talking about, well, you actually ground it, right? Which, once again, is something that in context we understand what that means. But then the Queens immediately go to ground. Well, actual surface area, why do you need ground to do this, right? And so, and there's like other things like that, in which like Alice is the most logical, not because she's necessarily the smartest or the cleverest, but just because she gets context for things, right? Yeah. That's really all I got for Through the Looking Glass. I think in a lot of like adaptations of this style, or of this book, we get a focus on kind of the initial trip through the looking glass, right? And then it gets kind of mixed in with some of the ideas from Adventures in Wonderland, where a lot of times that I've seen, we talk about the playing cards, and we talk about or we're shown the playing cards, and we're shown things like the Mad Hatter, right? But it's two very separate stories. It just so happens that also contain Alice in it, right? Because this one, Through the Looking Glass, is much more focused on chess as the main kind of thing, whereas Adventures in Wonderland is much more based in playing cards and kind of time relations, that sort of deal. This Through the Looking Glass has some things on time, but certainly not to the extent that Adventures in Wonderland did. Yeah. That's my very tired thoughts on Through the Looking Glass.